If I asked you what Sonic game was released in 1991, what answer would you give? Well, Sonic the Hedgehog, of course, the classic for the Sega Genesis which we went into a bit ago. A game that managed to knock Mario off his high horse and make him up his game. We know this, but what you might not know is that it wasn't the only Sonic game released that year. As you see, we also got Sonic the Hedgehog. Already it's getting confusing, bear with me. This was the very first handheld Sonic game to ever be released, for the Sega Game Gear, the console that may have totally failed to rival the Game Boy, but did have its own merits like having a backlit screen, as well as boasting a whole bunch of Sonic games. However, what you might not know is that some of these games also got console releases, and, in this case, the console version actually came out first despite being put into production after the Game Gear version. It would release in October 1991 on the Sega Master System, and December for the Game Gear. Now, the Game Gear Sonic games are probably some of the most remote games in the series, especially the console versions, as for the most part, when re-releasing the 8-bit games, they seem to like only giving us the Game Gear versions. Whether that's a good or bad thing depends on the game in question, but to see more about that, we should get started here. We're going to dive into both versions of 8-bit Sonic 1, and also 8-bit Sonic 2. To some, it might seem strange to look at this before its Genesis counterpart, but surprisingly, Sonic 2's 8-bit version came out before the Genesis version, and was therefore the first appearance of Sonic's new sidekick, Tails Miles Prower, and Silver Sonic, but I'd say that's less important. Apologies to any Silver Sonic enthusiasts out there, I'm sure there's one. So yeah, 2 handheld games that are also console games to supplement the console games. Didn't take long to start making my life confusing, but oh well, let's just go. Okay, 8-bit Sonic the Hedgehog. Let's get the basics out of the way. The story and setting are exactly the same. Sonic must stop Dr. Robotnik from stealing animals and corrupting South Island, though, would you believe it, 8-bit Sonic 1 not only shows this story better in-game, but it also makes sense as an actual journey and shows you how you're progressing. Between every level, a map pops up showing you where your journey is taking you on South Island. The second half of the game has another part of the map become revealed and shows all of these big factories, which is a stark contrast to the lush greenery of the first map. By collecting all the Chaos Emeralds, we actually see the island get cleaned up, as opposed to just some flowers growing. I know it's not revolutionary or anything, but you have to admit, the detail is admirable. As is the game. As the first Sonic game outsourced to another company, they really didn't do a bad job in understanding how Sonic should work and how level design should be made. The developers of this game were called Ancient, a company founded by a game composer who told Sega that he could develop games, called Yuzo Koshiro. He then hired his sister as director and mother as behind the scenes. God knows what that means. Maybe she was the person who decided to put an auto-scroller in a Sonic game, who knows. But yeah, for these guys and some programmers to be brought in and make a Sonic game that some people out there genuinely believe is superior to the Genesis game, as a first attempt? That's kinda crazy, and yeah, you heard me right. From time to time, I have come across comments and discussions of people saying that they actually like this game more. And to be totally honest, while I don't necessarily agree with that statement, this absolutely is a bit of a hidden gem. It's not perfect, but again, for a first try, it's a damn fun game, and honestly, it does do some things better than the Genesis game. Let's look at that console version first. It's a nice looking game for 8-bit standards. While it definitely suffers from some slowdown and sprite flickering, it's a very colourful game that captures the look and feel of the Genesis game, just in 8-bit. Sonic is about the same as he is in the Genesis version. He can run, roll, and jump, but the control isn't quite as tight. It's not bad, but it can be hard to be precise on small platforms. There is momentum, but it doesn't really feel as good in this game, comparatively speaking anyway. Like, absolutely if you roll downhill, you'll pick up speed, look at Sonic Go here, but due to the lack of things like loops or level structures that give you room to gain momentum, the only time you're really going to get much out of momentum is with these little curves at the end of some slopes, which send you absolutely flying. It's fun, if a little scripted, but it's the most speed you're constantly getting in this game, as the game's level design is definitely a little more fundamental, I guess? It's blockier, less slopes, less ways to gain speed by playing well, mostly due to the more linear stage design. Don't get me wrong, there are absolutely hidden things to find, like extra lives, shield power-ups, or the one other thing we'll come back to, but for the most part, there's only really one path through the level. Now, to be totally clear, that's not an immediate problem, as God knows this wouldn't be the only Sonic game with linear levels, but when it comes to 2D Sonic in this style, it can feel a little thin when going from point A to point B. You may be thinking from watching my footage, hang on, I don't remember a jungle level in Sonic 1. Well, that's because while this version shares a few zones with the 16-bit original, the other zones are totally unique. We have Green Hill Zone, Labyrinth Zone, of course, and Scrap Brain Zone returning, and I wouldn't say any of them quite match up to their Genesis counterparts. Green Hill is a fine enough level. I like how you end up underground in Act 2, something Sonic Mania would actually reuse many years later, but it's a pretty fun zone where you can actually outrun the camera if you're fast enough. That's fun. But there's not too much to say here. Labyrinth Zone is nowhere near as mean as in the Genesis version. The mentality is still the same, rush between the water bubbles as fast as you can, but you get way longer to breathe underwater and you're never too far from the surface. It's still very sluggish, and the slowdown can make it feel even worse. You also can't roll under these spike poles, which is a little annoying, but still, it's really not that bad. Plus, this game has an actual boss in this zone, as opposed to the Robotnik chase in the Genesis version, so I'm sure many people will be happy not to deal with that. Scrap Brain Zone is much easier here, Act 1 being over so quickly, look at that, 47 seconds. However, Act 2 is probably the most complex level in the game, having you loop around a few different rooms to flick a switch that allows you to get by. It's not difficult, but is a little confusing and something to highlight. The other zones are totally different. After Green Hill, we instead cross Bridge Zone, a level that is fairly standard, but Act 1 is pretty fun, bouncing off these weighted seesaws and being careful not to fall through the breaking bridges, and I just like the catchy music here. Act 2, however, oh, come on, it's an auto-scroller. In a Sonic game. No, no, no. That's just like the last thing that should ever be here. In all honesty, it's not that bad. And it's over fast. Just one of those things that should never come back. Then we have Jungle Zone, which, to be honest, I'm not big on. I mean, I like the vine platforms that you can roll off, that's fun, but there's a lot of leaps of faith in this level due to a bad view of what's coming, and in Act 2, any area below you becomes a bottomless pit when climbing this waterfall. A cool concept for a level, but it's so annoying when you just die for no fucking reason for making a tiny error on a small platform. Finally, we have Skybase Zone, the final stage, and I don't mind it for the most part, but the flashing on the screen hurts my eyes. I know it was never designed for modern TVs, but just take caution with this, and the waterfall in Jungle Zone, both make me feel a bit ill. But Act 2 is alright. Raiding the airship is fun, although I normally just skip most of this level by going underneath it, and there's a reason for that, but we'll get back to it. If you ask me, I think the reason people say that Sonic 1 8-bit has better levels than the Genesis game is because in this game, there aren't really any stinkers, and it's generally a lot easier to beat. I don't know this game nearly as well as the original, but I'll admit, it's definitely easier to get through for a first timer. It's easy to get extra lives and continues, and it really doesn't ask that much of the player. The boss fights are a little mean though. For some baffling reason, they decided to make it so there's no rings in any boss fight. Why? That's so annoying. These bosses aren't very hard for the most part, I must stress, but it still makes them a little more bullshit than they would have been otherwise. I fucking despise the Jungle Zone boss. I don't know why, but it always gives me so much shit. I know it's not that hard, but he always kicks my ass. I also found out this playthrough that you can bring shields into the next level. That's cool, but it barely helps you as Sonic has no invincibility frames when getting hit in boss fights, as the game expects you to die in one hit. It's annoying because most Act 3s don't have checkpoints, and while the levels aren't very long to get back for another attempt, it is a little bit tedious. But yeah, there are checkpoint monitors to break in this game, and it's fairly generous with them, so you should never be sent too far back. I mentioned earlier that collecting the emeralds in this game has a little more meaning, but I don't just mean that in terms of the story. Simply going from the beginning to the end of this game shouldn't take you very long, but if you want a bit more out of it, once again, collecting the Chaos Emeralds is going to be your biggest challenge. However, I actually much prefer how the Chaos Emeralds are handled in this game. In the Genesis game, you had to jump into a giant ring at the end of the stage with 50 rings and beat a maze-like special stage. In this game, you just find them lying about. It's a little weird, but hey, convenient I guess. The emerald can be in either Act 1 or Act 2, so you must keep an eye out for them. But if you know where they are, it's really not that hard to go out of your way to get them. Finding them for the first time though, is not very well thought out, as the later zones put them in some pretty stupid places. In Green Hill and Bridge Zone, it's super easy to find the emeralds by just exploring and using your brain. Jungle Zone has you ride the waterfall down to find a hidden area with a log to ride on, leading you to the Chaos Emerald, which you need a fairly keen eye to spot when running above it. The last three though, well, in Labyrinth Zone, you need to get this invincibility box here, then make a beeline towards the end of the stage, where just before the final jump, there's a Chaos Emerald within some spikes. It's not too hard to do, but that's still pretty stupid, as you're fucked if the invincibility runs out and you can't get it again without dying. Brilliant. Scrap Brain Zone has you defy logic altogether and jump into what looks to be a bottomless pit, right next to two other actual bottomless pits. This is extra stupid, as there's no way of knowing this without discovering it by total accident. Brilliant again. And then, Skybase. Skybase requires you to jump off the side of the ship at the very start to land on a little moving platform that you can just about see by crouching and panning your view down. That's so stupid. It's easy to find after you know that, just follow the route, but why? Getting the Chaos Emeralds is pretty stupid, but again, once you know, and it's much easier to do again, not breaking the flow of the game like the special stages do in Sonic 1. This game still has special stages though, but they are simply for gaining extra lives and continues. And honestly, despite how crazy it can get, these springs sending you up and down and all around, I actually prefer these special stages as a concept. You don't even have to jump into a giant ring, you just pass the goal, so yeah, that's cool. Sonic has passed. Oh shit, please send my condolences to the family. The music is great, with every song except Green Hill being totally original, and I enjoy the soundtrack, especially for the original zones. You'll never get me to hate Bridge Zone or Jungle Zone, these are both super catchy 8-bit tunes. But what about the Game Gear version? Well, it came out a few months later and, as a result, had some touch-ups. However, this does come at a cost of some screen crunch and unfortunately the loss of Sonic's nose. Maybe it was what passed on. To be honest though, in this game, the screen crunch isn't really that bad, and they were thoughtful enough to add some extra ring trails or platforms to make it easier for the player to know where to go, or at least feel a little safer. Jungle Zone, for instance, probably got the most changes, as there's now many more platforms to land on to make up for the potential lack of view, and they even fixed the bottomless pit bullshit in Act 2. That's not all that was changed though. I don't know if it's just me, but the Game Gear version feels a little better to play. I couldn't tell you if it's just my imagination, but it felt snappier, and the slight changes to level design made some of the more annoying moments more manageable. They moved the Chaos Emerald in Labyrinth Zone to make it almost impossible to miss, but I appreciate that, as the original placement was just silly. Seeing the platform for the Emeralds in Skybase, though, is pretty much impossible. You just have to know it's there. Bosses are much easier to hit in this version for the most part, as the smaller screen means you can normally hit the bastard earlier. They totally changed up the final boss too, and it's still fairly easy. And of course, I still hate the Jungle Zone boss. God. The Game Gear version may give you less view, but playing them back to back, I think it's easily the better choice. The small enhancements may seem insignificant, but trust me, I think it makes it worth it, and it's probably why it's the more available version. Not to say the Master System is bad. No, whichever version you play of this is a fun enough game that isn't too long, and is definitely a little bit of a hidden gem. Sonic left. Jesus, I can't keep him still. I do much prefer the Genesis game, but if they were to re-release the classic Game Gear titles on modern consoles, I'd say it's one of the ones to check out. However, I definitely wouldn't say the same for 8-bit Sonic 2. Okay, so to reiterate, Sonic 2 on the Game Gear came out slightly before Sonic 2 on the Genesis, and while I'm sure Tails was created for that game, I guess the production team just decided it would be okay to use him here. Despite 8-bit Sonic 1 being well received, they didn't stick with the same development team, instead outsourcing to Aspect Digital Entertainment, who I found out still made games until 2013, only going bust in 2018. Kinda crazy to think about. Apparently, there wasn't much communication between the Sega Technical Institute and Aspect when producing the two games, and you can sort of tell when, other than featuring Tails, the games share almost nothing in common with each other despite literally being called Sonic the Hedgehog 2. It's likely the reason that 8-bit Sonic 2 sticks to the 6 Chaos Emeralds and doesn't have a spin dash. No, as a game, it's fundamentally the same as the previous one, in structure and in gameplay. You travel across a whole bunch of zones and try to rescue Tails from Dr. Robotnik. Although for some reason, Tails appears on all the title cards between stages, despite not being with us. Weird. But yeah, the story is different, but the game is the same. You beat up bosses with no rings in Act 3, and collect Chaos Emeralds that are lying on the ground. However, in the case of this game, it's all much more annoying to do. Okay, before that, so Sonic 2 didn't get a Master System release globally, only in certain regions. This means that the Game Gear version is the more well-known version of the game, but unlike 8-bit Sonic 1, it's much more of an issue here. There are little to no changes between the versions except the screen resolution, so I don't feel too bad saying up front, if you want to play this, play the Master System version, because this is a horrible experience on the Game Gear. For years, I have considered 8-bit Sonic 2 to be one of the worst games in the entire series. I just hated it all. The level design, the bosses, the fucking pipes, the Chaos Emeralds, it just wasn't a game I could get much good out of. However, this is also my first time playing the Master System version, and, well, while it's still far from great, I was surprised how much just being able to see more made things better. It made me appreciate some of the more creative things that Sonic 2 does, and let's start with the positives. Firstly, unlike Sonic 1, this game has totally unique zones. Underground Zone, Sky High Zone, Aqua Lake Zone, Green Hills Zone. I swear that reminds me of something. No, must just be my imagination. Anyway, then we have Gimmick Mountain Zone and Scrambled Egg Zone. This game also has the distinction of being the first game in the series to lock the true ending behind the Chaos Emeralds, something that definitely caused split opinions across the fanbase. Here it locks the final zone, Crystal Egg Zone, and its boss behind finding the 6 Chaos Emeralds, this time always located in Act 2, which is nice, so you only have to worry about one act. Every emerald has a different colour, and speaking of the presentation overall, it's super impressive for an 8-bit game. The detail and sprite animation is amazing for the time. I love this little shrug Sonic gives Tails after saving him. He's like, who is this guy? I went through all of this for a randomer. Fuck this, I'm out of here. Where was I? Oh right, the levels. So, every stage in this game has something that makes them feel unique in a pretty creative way. But as a whole, the levels definitely feel more like Sonic stages than the last game. For one thing, there's actually loop-de-loops, as well as more gimmicks that emphasize speed, for better or worse. Underground Zone has you ride minecarts that travel pretty fast, but when they fall off the track, you can jump off them, and if you do it at the right time, you can reach higher platforms. Fun in concept, but actually making these jumps is harder than it needed to be. It's pretty much pixel perfect, and that sucks. Sky High Zone is all about bouncing on clouds over spike pits, and using hang gliders to cross other spike pits by riding the wind. Again, fun in concept, but problem 1, all the clouds look the same and it's hard to see where you're going to land, and problem 2, the hang glider barely works, and I almost always end up just falling. Aqua Lake is a fairly decent level in Act 1. I love how you can bounce over the water by rolling into a ball and skimming like a stone on the surface. It also has a really cool idea with the bubbles, taking a pre-existing idea and spicing it up to allow you to float upwards towards the surface. This is fun till that stupid section at the end with the massive enemy-filled shaft that sent me back down more times than I care to admit. I also found out that if you get 100 rings and an extra life, you can go back down to 0 and can die, so be careful of that. I also experienced some pretty bad knockback in Act 2, where I just couldn't regain my footing in time, likely due to the water. The game is pretty bad with knockback, but this was the worst of it for sure. Green Hills is a pretty good level really. It's got a good sense of speed, and despite not having a gimmick, other than showering you in extra lives, it's pretty fun. Until Act 3, where you are blindly bouncing to the next set of springs, making giant leaps of faith as you have no rings. I'll come back to Act 3s in general, so bear with me, but yeah, that sort of ruins Green Hills. Good job, guys. Gimmick Mountain has these spinning drums very similar to the ones in Scrap Brain Zone in Sonic 1 on the Genesis. They're a little finicky, but not too bad once you get the hang of it. There's only really one part about this stage I don't like, and it's right at the end of Act 1, where you essentially need to use the minecart to get across this bed of spikes. If you jump out, like we've been trained to do in the other levels, you will end up unable to cross the spikes and lose a life. Not a problem when you know it's coming, but still. Fuck Scrambled Egg Zone though. It makes me want to scramble him. These levels love tubes. Tubes that require you to press down in the right direction to not be sent all the way back down to the bottom, normally to a pit of spikes. And it just sucks. Act 2 is even worse, having to land on these platforms in such a specific way, otherwise you're essentially down a life. Ironically, the final zone, Crystal Egg Zone, is so much simpler and easier than this. So I don't know, maybe these two were accidentally switched. It's such a stark contrast. Look, I mentioned a lot of issues, but generally, like I said, the levels feel more Sonic-like, and the good bits do shine out as creative moments in a game that definitely has more of an identity than the first, even if that identity is a bit of an arsehole. It's like they had great ideas, but for every good idea, they also had to surround it with stupidity, and that can't be seen any clearer than in the Act 3s and the bosses. The bosses are generally great. They aren't always just Eggman. You fight a robot seal that bounces you on its nose in this game, and that's amazing, but the problem is, while most of these bosses are simple enough to understand, shit still happens, and they once again give you no rings. The reason this sucks is that some of the Act 3 stages are pretty hard, and getting back to the boss can take time when there's no checkpoints in this game. Why? That's such a stupid exclusion. Now in Act 1 and Act 2, it's not too bad as the levels in this game are mostly pretty short, but in the bosses, it's so tedious to have to replay the whole stage just for another attempt. The final boss is tedium incarnate, and all you have to do is wait for him to stop doing shit and pop out of the pipes with one hit. Then you wait, hit him, wait, hit him. It's so tedious. But remember, to get to this boss, you need the Chaos Emeralds, and once again they're just lying about, although it's harder to get them here, of course. Now, it's often not too hard to actually see the Chaos Emeralds this time, but getting them is another story. Underground Zone wants you to nail the perfect minecart jumps and stay on the top path. Sky High Zone wants you to bounce off very specific clouds to get the emerald, clouds that are hard to see on screen. Green Hills wants you to make very specific leaps of faith bullshit, Gimmick Mountain just hides it behind a wall you can just fucking pass through, and you get this last one for being Silver Sonic. It is a pain for sure, but normally it's the least of my issues with this game. The problem, simply put, is that the level design, while often clever in concept, is just overly punishing in a game that punishes you for not knowing exactly what's ahead, and that is never a good thing. I can absolutely see the positives. More now than I ever have thanks to playing the Master System version, because look at the Game Gear version. God, going back to this, it all came flooding back. There's no way I can recommend this version of the game. No way in hell. All those moments you had trouble reacting to in the console version, it's 10 times worse here, and the screen crunch is absolutely kryptonite. I can't see where the hell I'm going, and finding the emeralds here is harder because all those moments required precision before, but now? Good luck finding even one without a guide. The bosses are horrible, cramped into a tiny screen that makes the first boss, of all things, one of the most awful fights in the series. Just to bring attention to this, When this boss starts up, you're falling towards lava and Robotnik saves you. Why not just let Sonic fall in the lava, you idiot? Anyway, the Game Gear version, it's the worst, and it's something I never, ever want to go back to, and now I probably won't. Sorry Tails, you died. It was you who passed. But Sonic 2 on the Master System? Honestly, it's okay. All of those issues I had with the game design, I experienced all of that over the years, the few times I played the Game Gear version. But playing it on the Master System, yeah, the issues are still present, but far less hard to deal with. I have more room to breathe, I can get a better idea of what's around me, and I can beat the game much more comfortably. I can actually appreciate the clever ideas that were implemented here. And who knows, maybe with a little more time in development, it could have been a little better. But as is, it's okay. Not as good as Sonic 1 for sure, but definitely more ambitious, and I can respect that. So, thanks, Hitmen.
What the fuck?
So, that's our start into the Sonic handheld games, and I'm always happy to talk about games that are a little more niche in the wide scope of gaming, these two being no exception. Next time we come back to Sonic, it'll be with Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for the Genesis, and that's one I'm really looking forward to. And as I started it with Mario, why not with Sonic? Let's make a totem pole to keep updating. So, at the top so far, we've got Sonic the Hedgehog 1991 on the Genesis, then we got Sonic the Hedgehog 1991 on the Master System / Game Gear, because why not put them together, and then Sonic 2 8-bit at the bottom. Thanks so much for watching, and if you did enjoy the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing for more. We're diving into another franchise next time, so I'll see you then.